Hi, and welcome back to the Marty's Mods channel. For today's tutorial, we're going to edit a scene from Arkham Knight using only shaders in Reshade. If you've watched our previous tutorial video, you may have noticed the gray border around the shot. That border was created using Marty's soon-to-be-released Scene Weaver shaders. It allows us to pre-crop the image, hiding distracting elements from the scene. The gray border comes from Scene Weaver's Canvas shader and is meant to be temporary as a way to reposition and zoom out to help us focus on the image while we work. To begin, let's enable Launchpad and make sure it's at the very top of our shader order. Then, let's enable RTGI right below it. Now, almost right away, we can see as we adjust the bounce lighting intensity that we're getting a very strong bounce light on Batman's nose under the mask. Let's use the Insight shader to take a closer look. To deal with this, we simply need to adjust RTGI's ambient level and bounce lighting intensities. The ambient lighting slider controls how much of the original game lighting the RTGI shader will blend into the scene. With the ambient level all the way down, we can see that RTGI effectively removes the game lighting and replaces it with its own. For this shot, we'll adjust the ambient level to here. Before moving to the next step, let's take a look at our settings in the Launchpad shader. Notice here that we've enabled both the Smooth Normals and the Textured Normals options. The Smooth Normals option will fix issues with certain geometry in the scene looking overly blocky, while the Textured Normals option will attempt to derive the bumpiness of a surface. Launchpad then provides that information to the rest of Marty's Mods shaders. While we have the Insight overlay open, let's take a moment to address this grid pattern visible on Batman here. This pattern is not from anything we have running on Reshade, but from the game's own dithering. It's game-specific to Arkham Knight in this case. Unfortunately, we can't remove it here, but if the screenshot is taken at a high enough resolution, it won't be visible in the final shot unless someone were to pixel peep. Let's now go back to the RTGI shader. As we adjust the surface roughness here, we can see the reflections become soft and dull, or sharp and glossy, all while taking the surface bumpiness from the Textured Normals into account. For this scene, given that there are a lot of smooth metallic surfaces around, a more glossy setting feels the most appropriate. Next, we can enhance the scene lighting in a more direct way by placing our own virtual light into the scene. Here above this machinery, we can see that there is a light bulb here. Let's introduce our own point light there that can cast shadows and give us some interest on the right side of the frame of our image. And we can do that with the Relight shader. The moment we enable the shader, we can see that there are already two lights placed. But currently, it's nearly impossible to tell exactly where in the scene they're coming from. We know that they are somewhat centrally located in the frame, but we can't tell the depth or distance from the camera where the lights are placed. First, let's disable the second light, as we'll only be needing one. Then, let's scroll down to the debug options and enable the light overlay feature. Normally, this would show us very quickly the location of our light. But in this case, the opacity of the overlay was far too low from a previous scene edit, making the overlay difficult to see. We can easily fix that here. And now the light shows up in our scene, allowing us to easily position it in 3D space. Moving the light closer to the camera, we can see it light up and cast shadows on Batman's face and body. Though we'll want to move the light to a different position. Using the XYZ controls, let's get the light positioned directly where the light bulb is over this equipment to the right of our image. As we get closer to our final position, we can temporarily decrease the intensity to help us see things more easily. As we move the light to the right, Notice how it intersects with the scene geometry. With this in mind, we can place our light completely within this light fixture. Now that our light has roughly been placed, let's bring the intensity back up. Right away, we can see the light casting shadows, though we need to adjust the penumbra and push it up into the fixture a bit more. The penumbra effectively controls how sharp or soft the shadow edges become. Setting it to about here looks about right. Now, let's do a final adjustment of our light intensity, and let's also disable the light overlay, as we no longer need it. When adjusting our light intensity, we're just going to eyeball it and stop when it looks and feels natural. And here looks good. Toggling relight off and on, it's a small change to the scene, but an impactful one, and the added shadows look really nice. Now that we've adjusted the lighting of the scene, we can reduce the workload on the GPU by simply saving the frame in its current state, then disabling Launchpad, RTGI, and Relight. Similar to our last tutorial, we can do that easily with the long exposure shader. We simply need to enable it, then click on Start Capture. Once it's done, we can disable Launchpad, RTGI, and Relight, and continue with our editing. Let's now adjust SceneWeaver's canvas to zoom our frame back in a bit. And next, we can enable Solaris and Regrade. In Regrade, we're only going to bring down the white point slightly to ensure our brightest pixels reach pure white. Next, let's move to Solaris. In this scene, we're not actually going to use Solaris for its bloom, but instead for its photographic exposure. We're just going to lift the scene brightness slightly. For bloom, instead of Solaris, we're instead going to use our convolution bloom to give us some nice diffraction spikes on some of these bright light sources in our scene. Next, we'll add some focus to the scene by enabling depth of field. In this case, it looks like our focus is already where we want it, focusing directly on Batman, leaving our background blurred. Let's now go over some of the settings here. Two very important controls are the focal length and the aperture. These describe physical aspects and behaviors of lenses in the real world. First, we can think of focal length as the type of lens we want to emulate. The number here describes the simulated focal length in millimeters, which is how this is generally described on a real lens. Focal length in simple terms can be thought of as how narrow the field of view is or how zoomed the image is. A larger focal length gives less field of view and more zoom, and a smaller focal length will give a wider field of view and a less zoomed in image. This also has an effect on how blurry the out of focus areas become. The reason for this is that in the real world, with a larger focal length, perspective compression forces the blur to spread out more. With all of that said, Marty's depth of field shader will not zoom or change our field of view. However, the focal length setting will affect how blurry the out of focus area is. Only the effect that focal length has on blur has been simulated here. Moving next to aperture. This describes the mechanical opening inside all adjustable lenses that controls the amount of light coming in. These are usually made up of multiple blades that rotate circularly to open wide or close down to a small point. The smaller the aperture number, the less closed the aperture is and the more light is allowed in. And the larger the aperture number, the more closed down the aperture is and the less light is allowed in. You can think of aperture as being similar to your own eyelids. With your eyes wide open, you get more light into your eyes. However, if you squint, your eyes will get less light. Aperture is what directly creates the shapes that you see and out-of-focus areas in a lens, also known as bokeh. The exact bokeh shape is affected by the number of blades in the aperture and also by how open or closed the aperture is. A more open aperture will create larger, smoother shapes and provide more blur, and a more closed-down aperture will create smaller and sharper shapes and less blur. The number you see here is the f-stop number, which describes how open or closed the aperture is on a real lens. Together, both focal length and aperture will affect how blurry your out-of-focus areas are and how the bokeh shapes look. One other thing we can do to increase the render quality of our bokeh shapes is to enable the bokeh sprites option here. This will enable the shader to selectively optimize the appearance of the shapes in an intelligent way to maximize quality without a massive performance cost. With our depth of field adjusted, we're almost ready to move on to the next step in our process, and that brings us to the question of, should bloom be rendered before or after depth of field, as they're both lens effects? Normally, you would want to place depth of field before bloom in the load order, as that is the physically correct place for it, but in the case of this scene, it actually looks nice drawn after the bloom. Following the real world is often a great thing to do, but sometimes bending the rules if your image looks better that way is perfectly valid. This is another example of the statement made a few times in our last tutorial. If it looks good, it is good. One last thing that we can do to enhance the depth of field effect in our image is to actually go back to regrade and drop the white point down even more to drive the bokeh shapes to a more intense level. It's very easy to overdo this, so you have to take care. But in the case of this image, it works perfectly, as the only clipping areas are actually out of focus. Doing this, we can also see a bit better now how the bokeh sprites option in the depth of field shader is really increasing the quality of our bokeh. The result is much cleaner with it on, and with a much smaller performance hit, versus if we were just to brute force increase the bokeh render quality overall. The recommendation here is to enable the bokeh sprites option, then lower the bokeh quality as low as you can before you notice a degradation in image quality. Looking further below, we can enable some hidden bokeh controls by setting this value to 1. This unlocks a few more settings to allow us to better mimic some of the bokeh artifacts that you might see on a real lens used in, for example, a movie. For our example scene here, let's adjust the anamorphic ratio to mimic an anamorphic lens, and then we'll adjust the spherical aberration to taste. Spherical aberration should not be confused with chromatic aberration. Spherical aberration, in simple terms pertaining to this shader, is simply a darkening of the interior of your bokeh shapes. Let's now anti-alias and sharpen our image. We'll do that by enabling the Immerse SMAA and Immerse Sharpen shaders here. For this, we'll want to place these effects after depth of field. Ideally, for this sort of artwork for screenshots, you would want to disable a game's anti-aliasing if possible, which you would then apply your own anti-aliasing with reshade. This is generally best practice to avoid artifacts with edge color bleeding for any effect that utilizes the depth buffer, which in this case, depth of field does. Let's also enable the local Laplacian shader to bring some local contrast. Marty's Laplacian shader is the first real-time capable implementation of the same technique that Adobe uses in Lightroom for their clarity slider. As we adjust, let's keep an eye on our darkest parts of our image to avoid darkening them too much. We'll stop here as that looks nice. Lastly, let's polish our result now with a bit of color grading in Regrade Plus. As stated in our previous tutorial video, always remember to enable both Regrade Plus and the Regrade Plus histogram, and place the histogram below the main Regrade Plus shader. There. With that set up, let's move to the Regrade Plus UI. Let's start by adjusting the temperature and tint a bit. In fact, we can take a moment here, purely for demonstration purposes, to adjust the scope setting. To do that, we'll simply click here and change it to the waveform mode. This mode will give us a quick overview of the color balance and brightness of the entire image. For example, this part here is Batman, and this part here is the bright areas to the right of the image. This scope mode can be particularly useful if you're trying to white balance to a known gray surface, in this case Batman's suit. However, since this image is already well white balanced, let's just make a subjective choice and lean into the green vibe of the scene. For the rest, we're again going to continue making subjective choices about our image, experimenting and resetting values if we don't like the result. For curves, we'll add a point here to control our shadows, and a point here to control our highlights and adjust to taste. For our hue wheel in the hue and brightness mode, we'll make some adjustments to harmonize our image a bit better. In fact, this area of blue in the background here is a bit jarring perhaps. To deal with this, we can grab our cyan node and our blue node and move them over toward green. And just like that, it's less distracting. Let's quickly switch over to the hue and saturation mode by clicking here and adjusting our skin tones. To help us determine where we want our skin color to be, we can switch the scope setting to the vector scope mode. The line you see in the circle is about where you want your skin tones to be, and this goes for all skin types, darker or lighter. You can see as we move the orange node, the vector scope will show us how Batman's face is responding. We'll adjust until we're happy here, and we're done. This is really what Regrade Plus is all about, raw experimentation. There are no set rules here. Experiment until your heart is content. Remember, if it looks good, it is good. Now that we're ready to save our image, we'll disable Canvas and take the shot. And that's it. Another shot transformed using only shaders. We hope this has been enjoyable and helpful, and we wish you all the best in your own image editing adventures. This has been Trey with the Marty's Mods team. Have a great day.